This is Daniel King, and you're listening to George Fox Talks Wellness. How you doing, GFU family? This is Dan King, and I'm so excited to have my special guest, Dr. Rebecca Yazzie, joining us. And Rebecca is the program director here at George Fox University for the MSW, and she is a social worker. And I wanted to invite her to come and speak about lots of different cool things, but I just wanted to start off by just asking you the question, what got you into social work?
That's a great question. What got me into social work? So my undergraduate degree is in criminal justice, and I have family members that are police officers, well-tenured police officers, retired from law enforcement. And so I initially thought that's what I wanted to go into. But then I got my first job after undergraduate work and quickly realized that lots of people are suffering, and they're suffering on a number of different levels and in different ways. And so it prompted me to go back to get my master's degree in social work. And so the primary reason I went into social work was really to find out how I could help alleviate people who are just in pain and all different kinds of pain. There's physical pain, right? There's emotional pain, there's psychological pain. So, and to really think through how to advocate for these individuals, families, and communities to make some larger systemic change.
Yeah. I like that a lot. So you talked about pain. What aspect of pain do you think that made you say, I'm going to kind of leave the law enforcement, world and kind of more into social work? Was it more the psychological? Was it more the community or the substance? Was it family? What do you think that was?
Yeah. One word, trauma. So trauma, as we've all experienced in the last couple of years through a shared trauma, i.e. the pandemic, shared trauma in mass school shootings, shared trauma in natural disasters, right? So we think of trauma as like, sometimes people think of trauma as it looks one way, which is just, there's all kinds of different types of trauma. So when I say pain, I think of generational trauma, if you are a child growing up in a home that has parents who are abusing substances, that's trauma, right? There's all these sort of adverse experiences. So that's what I'm referring to, is just children and families who are exposed to lots of different small traumas, big traumas, and then also the difficulties they have, and just figuring out how to heal from that. And we see challenges in that because it gets really sticky.
Yeah. So you went from your master's and then you got a PhD, right?
I did. I don't know why. No, just kidding.
So did you then at that time was there something that you were trying to figure out, or did you feel like there was something more that you wanted to study at that point?
That's a great question. I eventually came to the point where I wanted to teach, social workers who wanted to go into the career of independent social work practice, which is typically the graduate level. So my first goal was to get a PhD so that I could begin to teach right at the graduate level. But the second goal I really had was to do a little bit of research and find out more about how we serve our incarcerated individuals, primarily juveniles, young people, and what kinds of services are offered to them, more from a systemic framework, and are they equitable, who's getting the services, who's not, and evaluating that. So that was the other reason I kind of, wanted to get a PhD.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you also serve something on a board or for the government or the governor?
So I do a little bit of work with consulting and a couple different platforms. So I do some work with the Clemency Board here in Oregon, looking at juvenile cases. I also have worked with the Oregon Board of Parole and Post-Prison Supervision, working with their team to help be a little bit more trauma-informed in their practices. Yeah. So, I do a lot of consulting and board work with those couple of entities.
Yeah. I think you're really one of the first people I've actually been able to sit down with and actually ask questions about social work. Now, I know social workers. One of my neighbors is a social worker, and I've spoken with her, but I've never been able to really ask her kind of like more of the questions. So to practice in the state of Oregon, do you just need an MSW, or can you have a bachelor's degree and practice as a social worker as well too?
Great question. So yes, oftentimes people, they ask what is social work, right? And so this is kind of a nice very short statement that I could help to answer that question. So social work is really known as a practice-based profession that promotes social change, development, connection, and empowerment of people and communities.
Got it.
Right? So that's the core of what social work as a profession is as a discipline. You can practice at two different levels in social work as a discipline. At the undergraduate level, which you could do case management, you can work as in child welfare, you could probably work in schools, doing some support roles. And then you can also practice at the graduate level, which is considered independent social work practice. And the three levels of practice that we have in our discipline, there's three levels. So there's the micro level of social work, which is really working one-on-one with individuals or small groups. Maybe at your church, you're leading a support group. There's the meso level of social work, where this is where we see people working in prisons and in jails, in hospitals, medical social work, in schools as a school social worker. And then at the macro level, a lot of people don't know that macro level social work is everywhere. There's congressmen and women who have MSWs. The macro level is working at systemic change, policy change, community organizing, right? Community development. So you can practice social work at two different levels, and you can practice social work in about three different spheres.
Wow.
Which is really kind of cool.
That is cool. Do you know like roughly how many social workers there are? I mean,
I don't know. I know there's a great need, but I don't know exactly how many.
Got it.
Yeah.
So when you mean great need, there's a lot of job opportunities right now.
There's a lot of job opportunities right now,
right.
Especially with the influence of the pandemic.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much for answering that. I kind of wanted to touch back to what you said in the beginning, and the understanding of like, why did you pick like working with people in jails, right? People who are incarcerated. Like, was it because of your background? Was it because of your family members? Was it trauma? I mean, how did you get involved with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I fortunately did not come from a family who had, my own family of origin did not have individuals who are incarcerated. I think everyone who probably goes into social work or the helping professions has been exposed to some type of adverse experiences or trauma. So I'm definitely not immune from that. But I think what really drew me to corrections, both juvenile and adult, was that I am a person of faith, and my faith tradition really challenges me to be the 2 feet of Jesus, like charitable works, but then also addressing social justice. And that's one thing that I think we forget about. We talk about marginalized communities and communities who might be poor, vulnerable, but there's a segment of the individuals who often get ostracized. And, a lot of these individuals have committed crimes and made really poor decisions. So once they are in the system, though, we can't forget about them, right? There's some humanity and some dignity that is still should be maintained. So I was just drawn to that population, especially the younger folks, because, they need a lot of support and they need a lot of compassion. And they're a very challenging population, but they are the most rewarding population to work with. And every day was an interesting work day.
Yeah, I can only imagine, right?
Yeah.
To be able to sit with that. We had another guest who said that when she looked at her life work, she thought to herself that the people that she wanted to sit with was the specialty she actually chose. And I shared with her that for me it was chronic pain patients. That's who I wanted to spend time with. And I kind of hear you saying the same thing, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's like if you were going to pick a practice area, that would be an area that you would want to sit with, right? And spend time with and help those people, and in another way kind of helps us, right? Have perspective.
Yeah.
So when you do your work, when you do your consultant work, I mean, what are some of the things that they're looking for when they're looking at clemency and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, so in terms of because I'm a social worker and I come to this perspective from a perspective of a holistic viewpoint, right?
Yeah.
So what is holism? There's pieces of, so I bring to that particular work group a mental health perspective, but a perspective of restoration, right? So if this person is going to be released, or when this person transitions, or when I'm working with these folks in institutions and we're preparing them to return back to our community, how do we consider, right, the wholeness of them and who they are as an individual? Yes, there's these circumstances and crimes, and there's victims.
Yeah.
Let's be clear, there's an impact on the community.
Of course.
But how do we consider all those things and still sort of give this person a chance at success?
Yeah.
And it all comes back to, like you said earlier, how do we relate wellness to some of these things? And it's holism. It's that the core of oneself, through a lot of different domains, physical, spiritual, emotional, psychological. So I hope that's what I do. I try to bring that perspective of, have we considered their trauma, their support system, the work that they have done to be rehabilitated, right? I mean, a lot of folks are doing that. They're doing the good work. And so just bringing that kind of a perspective.
Yeah. I love that word, restoration. I think it's such a powerful word. What are some of the examples that you can think of from your time as in academics, but also maybe in your practice of maybe examples of restoration for somebody, and it doesn't have to be someone who's been incarcerated. It could be anybody that you've worked with, because I think one of the things coming more from a biomedical tradition, the new, the thing that's been around, people say it's new, but it's been around for 40 years, is the biopsychosocial, right? And I feel like the social part, a lot of people don't get, right? And no one really talks about restoring something, right?
Right.
And I think that when you talk about community, when you talk about social support and all these things, right? I think they're so important. So I just wanted to know if maybe you had an example that you think is like something that we can maybe model after, or say this is really important.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind immediately from a example of like what can the community do, or a systemic example, is in the work that I do, these folks have a lot of barriers, right? So they're doing the work that society or the courts has asked them to do.
Okay.
And if they are doing it and they're achieving it, now they're sort of, okay, I've done what I've needed to do. In a restorative justice model, like is the community and society and my neighborhood and my family, are they ready to then accept me back? And one of the examples that we see a lot, which we need more of, is employers that will be willing to hire individuals with these backgrounds. That's one specific example of restorative thinking, right? Like harm has been done, but we're going to give this person an opportunity to restore and give back, right? So employers who do that. I think another example that I've seen in my work in juvenile corrections is just really encouraging families to be involved in the rehabilitation process. And that's hard when people have been hurt and harmed. But when I've seen, we call it like clarification, when family can come together, and sometimes it's their own siblings in the home who've been affected. Sometimes it's parents themselves who've been offended. But when we come together and do that really challenging work, the clarification and that restoration of what has been harmed can be very, very powerful. So that's an example of where I think if we're willing to lean into that, people can feel whole again to some degree.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. How difficult is it to try to get family involvement with somebody, or maybe even societal, right? We can go even global and say, there's a stigma for some people who've been incarcerated who, like you said, jobs might even be, maybe even colleges or education, right? Or anything, because they ask you, have you had a misdemeanor? Have you had a felony, right? They ask you. And when you hit those, or you mark those off, knowing that you might get a follow-up question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so what are some of the ways do you think we can learn as a society, or maybe even as families, to kind of, I don't know if the word is forgiveness. You probably have another word, right?
Yeah.
But it's just like accept, and recognize.
Right.
And then to give people grace and another chance, right?
Yeah, I think, and I think you make a good point there, Dr. Hank. I think that, especially in the work that I've done around trauma, forgiveness is a concept that is very individualized. So, we can't just say, forgive everybody for what's happening. But one of the things I think how to get families kind of engaged is, I think, as a society and as a community, and then of course in social work, we're trying to help people understand that without an opportunity for growth, right? The people who have harmed us may not be able to live a productive, successful life. And the whole goal is that we hope that they won't harm anyone again.
Right.
That's the whole goal. So
right.
As a society, we don't want recidivism. As a society, we don't want subsequent acts, right?
Yep.
But we have to take part in the process in which that healing can happen.
Yeah.
And so that healing can look different
for
every family or every victim.
Right.
But it's even just the opportunity to engage in that might be good.
Yeah. So are there stages of healing? that are out there that people study? I know there's stages of grieving,
sure, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But like stages of healing, because I mean that's such a powerful thing, thinking about it, right? Like, how do we heal from something that's so deep, especially something like trauma,
Right.
especially with all the things that are happening right now in our world, right?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a very interesting thought around that.
Yeah. I think without the literature right in front of me, I can just say that when it comes to healing from trauma, I think people first and foremost they'd have to be aware that they've been traumatized.
Right.
And I think as a society, I think we're getting a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
But as you had said earlier about concept in your work, the concept of trauma has been around a long time.
Right.
But we're I wouldn't say just now, but with the pandemic, right?
Yes.
We're finally kind of recognizing it.
Yeah.
But it's been around a long time, So
Right.
the first step that we can all do is even just get educated on like what kinds of trauma are there,
Yeah.
because there's all different categories. There's like I mentioned before, systemic, natural disasters. There's interpersonal. There's all kinds of stuff. There's organizational trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
We see that in the workplace right now with having to transition back to work, right? So the first step, I think, is just becoming more aware of that trauma exists.
Yeah.
And I think I was talking to a colleague earlier today who is a provider, a social worker, and working with someone who just transitioned out of prison. And, we had this conversation and he was very frustrated with the client and he was, kind of going on. And I said, well, let me ask you this. I said, have you considered that being in prison that long he's experienced systemic trauma?
Yeah.
And what kind of compassion do we have towards that?
Right.
Versus the compassion we might have towards somebody who was in a horrific car accident
Right.
and experienced the trauma.
Yeah.
So that's the first step,
Right.
is kind of recognizing that different kinds exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think that we are, as society, are getting a little bit better at it. But do you think that we might be getting like too focused on trying that?
That's another great point that's out there right now.
Yeah.
It's a good thing that we're more trauma informed,
Right.
but it's also, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can get rid of all kinds of triggers and all kinds of hurt. I mean, people are humans, and sometimes negative things happen to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that we are still in the process, especially in different contexts, figuring out what's the best way to approach healing.
Yeah.
And keeping people safe.
Yeah. I mean, I think you hit it right on the nose. I mean, from what I've noticed, and again, don't have the literature in front of me, but thinking about it, I know that safety is like a crucial thing. I've spent more time making my students feel safe in the last 2 years than I have in 8 years before that. Right. And that's safety in knowing what's going to happen,
Right.
safety in the classroom, if there was going to be a natural disaster or if there was going to be an intruder, right, who's going to cause a threat. It's like all of these safety measures I do right up front with them so that they feel like there's a plan in place,
Right.
and that they feel safe by the things that we're doing. And I've really gotten a huge response from the class thanking me for spending time doing that, where 5 years ago, I'm not doing that. It's like, it's in the syllabus, right? We may talk about some of the things in the syllabus and the curriculum, but then we moved on. And I used to think, as I was doing this, I was talking to one of my lab instructors, and he used to be a student. He's like, you used to never do that. I'm like, yeah, but I think that we really need to do that. And I think that is being more trauma informed, because they're all coming back from being online. And they want to know, is the rules still the same, right?
Right.
Is something going to happen? Is that what is that going to be? But I've been wondering if there's anything else that I'm missing. Is there something more that I can do, right, to help others who've been traumatized or have had trauma happen to them? And what else can I do to help, develop community?
Yeah.
Because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to let them, because they're going to go and they're going to work with people too.
Right.
So how do I help them have efficacy to go out and, develop their own relationships, but also develop their community, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah. And I think you're speaking to kind of when you asked, what are the steps, right? And I think so there's the trauma awareness and knowledge, and then it's putting it into action. But I think there's what you just described a moment ago is part of that healing process is helping people build trauma-resistant skills. So, there's like I said earlier, there's this, the world, we cannot all be protected from a world of harm. We just can't.
Right.
I wish we could, but we don't have that power.
Right.
And so it's helping people increase that window of tolerance in a
Yeah.
safe way. So it's not that we have to, I think we try our best to make sure people are safe, but also balancing that with, we want them to build those trauma resistant skills so they can stay in that window of tolerance where they are going to be sort of impacted by stress and adverse experiences and suffering, but that they can navigate that, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the goal.
Wow. You're opening up a whole new world for me. I'm not kidding. I mean, I've been studying the biopsychosocial for so long, and I've been really waiting for this conversation to talk to someone who's an expert on the social component. I have a lot of friends who are behaviorists, psychologists, especially, as you know, and it's just so wonderful to talk about that. What are some of the skills that you teach people to like be able to tolerate or be able to be resilient when these stresses or even triggers are happening?
Yeah.
Are there, and I know that might not be your specialty, but I just wanted to ask if there's anything, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who are listening who this is probably, we've all kind of gone through it just through the pandemic, but also other things. Is there certain things that you usually suggest that people start with when they're thinking about this?
Yeah. And so, yes, great question. And I will kind of put out my disclaimer. I do teach practice classes. I am nowhere near trained as a neurobiologist, but there's great neurobiology out there now that's informed us as social workers of how to help people, use that brain science to really sort of take command of their own bodies and their own physiologies. So there are some things, and I think that it could be 2 or 3 simple things that people start to do as a daily practice. And one can be more intuitive to us if you are a person of faith, but meditation/prayer or mindfulness activities are really good. And I think the second one that people don't really realize is can be helpful is gratitude exercises. Gratitude exercises we know helps strengthen the there's a little cingulate, I forgot the name of it, but it kind of connects. There's a piece that connects the left and the right hemisphere. So gratitude helps us to sort of have that emotional impulsive reaction. If we do gratitude over a period of time, it'll help us have that skill of, okay, I'm having this emotional reaction, but also I can sort of in the moment say, but I'm grateful for this. I see this other part. So that I don't completely sort of have a emotional reaction. So it's more of a response versus an emotional reaction, right? And the other thing, it's simple things. I mean, without getting into, like you said, more therapeutic skills and stuff that people can do, but believe it or not, physical exercise, cardiovascular, at least 20 minutes, I think. At least if you get that heart pumping. It helps with a lot of anxiety and this, right? Depression and all kinds of things. So get people moving.
It's so true, but a lot of people find it almost a threat.
I know.
Right? For those who want it, right?
Right.
Especially like, feeling your heart pump or worrying about pain afterwards, right? Delayed onset. And so it's been really interesting to actually help frame that. So what we do now is we really want to know what the goal of the person is. And then we break it down into really small pieces. And then we start doing our like meaningful movement around there.
Right.
So we had a case the other day where she's such a wonderful woman, but her daughter told her something that triggered her with her trauma, and she journaled it, and she had all of this systemic pain come back. And she came back and she's like, I don't think I can exercise because I have so much pain. So she shared with us some things that were in the journal, and we asked her what her goal was. And she says, if I could get a tire and a bat, I would just hit the tire with the bat over and over and over. And we didn't have that. But what we said to her is like, well, when was the last time you did a push-up? And she's like, I don't know. So what we did is we had her do a wall push-up. And when she did is when she was doing a wall push-up, she would push off the wall as hard as she can. And she thought about pushing her problems away and then kind of coming back. And so I said, these are like mindfulness exercises. And she's like, I never would have thought about that, right?
Yeah.
And then we got her PVC piping, and then we got a little ball, and she was like hitting it with it. And she was saying that, she says, I was so encouraged because you listened to me. And I realized it's like, imagine if I did our standardized exercises and not listened to her about what she wanted to do.
Right.
I think that we may have missed it, right? If I put her on the treadmill, if I put her on the bike, I mean, these are all great things, but she got such a good workout doing that. And then she was ready to do treadmill walking because she felt like she was heard.
Right.
And I think that a lot of times as a physical therapist, I feel like we really need to listen to the patient or listen to the person. I don't know if you've had that same thoughts as you're working with people, right?
Yeah.
Really listening to them and saying like, okay, well, we don't have that, but we can definitely work on these things.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what at the heart of social work is, as a profession, really using like client-centered approaches, right? So it would be really important. And that's especially important when you're working with different stages, right? Because in social work, you're not just working with adults, right? You might be working with children. And so how do you get, an 8-year-old to get cardiovascular, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's going to look very different.
Very, very
And they're probably
different.
going to have an opinion about how they do that, right? Which is great, which is fine, because that's client-centered. It's listening to what, and in our work, in our profession, the clients are the experts of their lives, right? So like probably many professions. So I think it helps us in our profession to also take a step back and say, I might have this graduate training, but you're the expert in your life, and I'm going to glean on your wisdom because, that honors diversity, that honors different world or life experiences. To ask them what's been helpful for them, right? And what resource has been helpful for you versus me telling you what I think your resource should be.
Yeah,
So
I love that.
Yeah.
You've already touched on this, but I wanted us to have just a few moments of maybe talking about it. Why do you think faith is such an important component, or it should be a component of our society?
Yeah. One of the things I love about our MSW program at George Fox is that we integrate faith, right, in social work practice teaching. And so that's unique to us in terms of our program versus other programs in the state. So both professionally and personally, I believe that faith can, when we talk about, again, holism and a holistic view of somebody, their sense of being, right, and who they are, and their overall well-being is really impacted by the presence of faith.
Yeah.
So there's lots of also, especially in substance abuse field, literature around if someone identifies with a faith community, like what the protective factors could be, right? And so I think if we know that, and as social workers, then we need to really connect people with that.
Yeah.
But also at that macro level I was speaking to earlier, how can we engage faith communities and even having more AA groups or support groups? Or so I think, and because then that leads to the community building and support system. So I think faith is, again, from a professional and personal perspective, faith must be at least assessed. And if again, because we are client-centered, so that's okay. But we also think about spirituality in social work practice, like just who we are, how we connect to one another, right? Humanity and who we are in this large world. So that could be, even if it's not quote unquote a formal faith tradition or a formal religiosity, but like helping people just see that like we are one person, but there's so much stuff bigger than us that we connect to, right? Whether it's the land or one another, or I mean, like that's, an existence that should be cultivated. So faith is just an important thing in our overall well-being. And it helps people cope with when that is the suffering. I also, to be, like I said, to be clear too, there's, faith and other aspects of spirituality that can cause trauma, right? So I think we have to recognize that, but it can't, if it's experienced really positively and healthy, then it's a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you go about having a conversation like that without feeling like you're going to offend somebody?
Sure.
Right? Because we do have this discussion, and even in my profession, right? Like talking about, spirituality and also faith. Is there a way that you discuss that in your program? And have you found ways to, be able to talk to someone about it with, being able to not, I'm not trying to be like, oh, we have to be PC, but making them feel safe.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. I mean, even working in the jails, I don't know. I mean, it's a very unique population. So because I don't know really if they do have a faith background versus like if we're in this setting, sometimes we know more transparently. So I think for social workers, when we're trying to talk and engage around support systems, that's a good kind of vehicle to get there.
That.
Who's your support system?
Yep.
And if they're speaking family only, then you can kind of extend that spear. Is there anyone in your community that you're connected with? You start extending that spear. And if they don't mention faith or they don't mention specific, formal elements of that, that's one way you can get there. Or if you know that they come from a faith background, of course, just directly asking, right?
Yeah.
But the way I do it is because I acknowledge that again, that spiritual experience could look very different for different people. I don't want to assume it's a positive experience. So I might say, what role,
right,
has faith had in your life?
Yeah.
Because that's an open-ended question where they can kind of tell me, I actually was raised this way or that way, but I'm away from that right now. Okay. Or, I was raised in this and I'm very, very traditional. But I think the other way is just again, the vehicle is like, who is your support system and what do you lean on to get through pain, or what do you like, who do you lean on, or what do you lean on? Do you have a practice that you use to help you get through these things, and people eventually kind of get to that, like they'll say, so I think at least in our profession, we teach students like, because I think there's a misconception that we can't directly ask, but you can. I mean, it's kind of those contextual practice skills, right? Like you got to kind of, with that practice wisdom, right? You'll know where to go and when to go. But I think just asking people like, how do you cope with these things? What do you do? So that's one way.
Yeah, that's actually a wonderful way. I really have learned so much from you already, just the way that you communicate with people and how you are respectful, but at the same time trying to understand the important things to them. I wanted to ask you another question about faith. How do you see faith and religiosity or religion? Is that something different? I mean, because religiosity or religion in itself is kind of like a community, right? Yeah. And then faith is sometimes more personal, right? Right. Like, how do you see that, right? When someone says, I love, I have a faith, but I don't want to be affiliated, right? You prefer that, right?
Yeah. I think one of the things that and hopefully here in our program, we try to help people understand is, I think as a social worker, as a professional, we have to understand that we're helping people to act, like I said earlier, what is social work, right? Empower themselves and to create, development and connection. So one of the things that I would say is that religiosity might have more structure, or there's an organization connected to that. So there's mores and there's traditions and there's things like that. They're much more structured. Faith for one person, like you said earlier, could be their relationship with God, or their relationship with another spiritual being, or their relationship with the earth. I mean, we talk about indigenous communities, right? Some identify in religious spaces. Some identify more as a traditionalist, which could their faith could have much more broader. It's not linear. So that's how I differentiate, and I think that. It's important to recognize those too, because, people are going to come into our spaces, our classrooms with varying degrees of that. But I think a part of our role, hopefully, is to help them through that spiritual journey, kind of figure out and grapple with that. And I think that's a great opportunity for us, not only as professors here at Fox in our role as teachers, but in social work. That's another part of somebody's holistic being that maybe they're searching to navigate, and we should step into that with them.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I mean, that holistic approach is challenging for clinicians as well as professors, as students, as we grapple with it, right? And I think that I really appreciate you actually giving a space to actually think about it in that perspective. I always give a little bit of time to the guests to share anything. If you felt like there's something that you wanted to share, right, about social work, or maybe even from your own experience, right? Because our audience is a wide base. It could be from students to alums, right? People, supporters of George Fox. It could just be like they're just on YouTube and they saw us, right? And they're like, hey, they look good, like fun people to listen to. So it could be lots of different reasons. But I just wanted to know if there was anything you wanted to share. Just in kind of your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think actually, thank you for that. I do. I think that after being in this profession a really long time, again, just referencing a lot of the horrific stuff that goes on in our world, just encouraging, like what I've learned is that, people are resilient, and we really are, right? And so just really recognizing that, and as I started off this conversation, that it's not necessarily that we need to forgive everybody, or we need to, sort of let go of harm or not have any accountability. But it's encouraging people. I've seen a lot of things, and I've heard a lot of things, and I've read a lot of horrific things. But how can I show up every day and still have compassion towards other people? that, if we could do a lot more of in our communities, would really strengthen us.
Yeah.
It's hard to do. It's hard to hold two in the same space, right? It's hard to see a mass school shooting one morning and then go to a meeting where we're advocating for people to get out of jail.
Yeah.
But you have to do both.
Yeah.
Because life is about both.
Yeah.
So that's my lasting piece is like, I hope people can really be courageous in that way.
Yeah.
And it's not easy, but if more people did that, it's kind of, and that's one example, but it's, I think I mean it in a broader sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's such a profound thought, actually. I always call it the tension. Mm-hmm. It's like there's always tension in our life, right?
Always.
And always. And I think that for us, we're so grateful to have a faith that actually makes us probably go deeper, right? Because when we have a lot of tension, I think we go deeper within ourselves because we're like, we don't really always understand why why that happens or why that occurred. Yeah. But how do we still be able to be compassionate or empathetic people and not to be so jaded, right? Yeah. And I think that you said it in such a wonderful way of saying that. And I feel like that is such a great, perspective to have, especially this time in our lives. So I just want to thank you for this time again. Thanks for joining us at GFU Digital. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks.
Yeah. This has been a production of George Fox Digital. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to George Fox Talks on Apple, Spotify, or whatever you're streaming on. Check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks, where we have videos, publications, and more. And we're also on YouTube at youtube.com/GeorgeFoxTalks.